International Version. And Ezekiel said, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, and set me in the middle of a valley, and it was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them. And I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. And he asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' And I said, 'Sovereign Lord, you alone know.' Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.'" We now hear the music for preparation. This message of how difficult it is to be rich and to enter the kingdom of heaven. Hear these words from Luke's gospel. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And so Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed Jesus gladly. And all the people heard this and began to mutter, "Jesus is gone to be a guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So ends our reading. Let us meditate on these words in the sanctuary of our hearts and minds. A little ill this week, so bear with me. So this might be far out, but here we go. So I was in Boston recently, and it brought back these really vivid Halloween memories for me, including one year when we were in our teens and we took a family trip just north of Boston to Salem, Massachusetts. And it was this time of year, and we went to enjoy not only the foliage, but of course to always learn a little bit more about New England history. And as many of you know, Salem is famous for having this Christian fundamentalist problem, the Salem witch trials, late in the 1600s, as mass hysteria and misogyny and fundamentalism raised by Puritans resulted in the drowning and the burning of 20 women accused of being witches. So there we were on this family trip in Salem. Karen, Stephen, and I were teenagers. There were lots of children and adults about. They were dressed up as wizards and superheroes and, yes, witches. And we were just outside of Salem, the Witch Museum. And there was this preacher on the corner across the street from the museum, and he had this bullhorn, because I think that's the best way you can get nuance in your preaching, really, with a bullhorn. And he was shouting how terrible all these things were that everybody was doing, that children were dressed up as wizards and witches. And I was trying hard to ignore him. I was trying really hard, and he was building up, getting to a crescendo, and there we are walking right to the front of the museum. And then he builds up to this head of steam, and he's really preaching, and he gets to the point and he says, "God hates Halloween." And I had to say something to him, so I turned to him in my teenage self, probably channeling the inner witch in me, saying, now that's taking God's name in vain. That's breaking the third commandment right there. And I think he was a little stunned because he was used to people heckling him, I assume. There were hecklers all over the place, but not quoting scripture, never mind a teenage girl. And he was kind of quiet for a second. And then he started saying, well, Halloween promotes witchcraft and wizardry. And I look around here today and I think, well, maybe some of us do too. And my sister Karen said very loudly, well, I love witches. And he didn't like that one bit. And he started to point around at everyone saying, see, this is what they're doing to our children and our young people. So we crossed the street and we went on and we had a fascinating afternoon. But I think about that because, there was something he was saying that was true. If you look in the book of Leviticus, it condemns witchcraft and witchery, but it also condemns blended fabrics. How many of you have blended fabrics on today? So I think let's not get too hung up on the literalism. I think it's this mode of Christianity that we see so often, not just on people on the street corners with bullhorns, but in many churches, this mode of Christianity. And it's not just in this country, it's happening globally. You think about what's happening in Brazil right now with the elections, that focuses on condemnation, that seems to be grounded in superstition more than faith and science. It's based on fear and self-protection and hatred and division and judgment and exclusion rather than hope and joy and community with God and ourselves and everyone and everything. And I think that preacher might have been well-intended. I think that preacher might have really wanted to be bringing people closer to God. But in fact, I think that preacher was doing the exact opposite, pushing people away because of a narrow view of what faith was saying. If you're not this way, then you're on the outside. And I think in light of the Reformation, the ongoing Reformation that Reformation Sunday lifts up, this has been, unfortunately, the practice of so many religious institutions. They tend to ossify, they tend to harden, they tend to be tribalism, backward thinking. And for millennia, holding on tightly and saying, if you don't do this particular thing, then you're on the outside. And I think that was the opposite of the ministry that Jesus was really living. Jesus looked for people who had been excluded by society, excluded by the religious authorities, widows, the sick, imprisoned people, women, children, people of all faiths and none, nationalities, tax collectors, and said, no, come and be with me. Be with us, eat with us, sit and let's talk, let's learn together. I think that's what our faith is supposed to look like. And so these stories in the Bible, especially the spooky ones, they're kind of fun for Halloween because they look death in the eye and they laugh. We've had people say, oh, Halloween, no, that's not Christian. I think that's nonsense. I think it's deeply rooted within the Christian and Judeo-Christian traditions. The gospel message from Ezekiel is to look death in the eye, to see the dry bones scattered, and to say, you have no power over me, death. Not because we won't die, not because we won't suffer, not because it won't hurt, but because we can look at those bones and say there is more to life than just clinging to it. New life is always possible. There is always new life coming. There's always more. And it's easy, I think, in the climate that we're in and the times we're in, whether you're talking about the existential threat to our climate or geopolitical relations, to say, all I see are dry bones. There is more. There is new life to be breathed in. But we need to turn to a power greater than ourselves, and we need to turn to one another. So the message, God says, prophet, look, can these bones live? And any sensible person like us would say, no, of course not, there's no hope. But the prophet turns to God and says, only you know. And God says, prophesy to these bones, speak to these bones, make them live again, make the sinews and muscles reconnect so that they will come alive again. That is the message. It's not, don't do this, don't do that. It's a message of hope, which brings us to today's gospel, that there's something more, there's always new life. So near the end of Jesus' public ministry, when the pressure's getting on and he's becoming more and more political, he pursues Zacchaeus, another lost sheep who's both rich and supposedly corrupt. So Jericho was extremely wealthy, and Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. So he was very much a part of the oppressive system of imperial occupation by Rome. So his income depended on being part of the system, preying upon his own people, and colluding with the empire. So it's how he made his money. And I think it's easy to just say, oh, he was an outlier. But I think we're all part of the system. There's a part of Zacchaeus in all of us. And so in today's story, earlier Jesus says, woe to you who are rich. How hard it is to enter this kingdom of heaven, to be like God's child, to remember who you really are when you're so attached, when you're holding on so tightly to the system. But here, in today's story, Jesus is seeking to do that, to facilitate exactly that, to liberate someone who is bound so tightly to the oppressive, capitalistic, imperialistic system, to bring salvation to this house, to resurrect these dry bones, to bring forth change, a new life. One of the things I've been thinking about is there's really this ambiguity in Zacchaeus' motivation because of the language in the original Greek. It's present and future tense. It's a question. I give to the poor here and now 50% of everything. I will give to the poor 4 times if I have frauded anyone. So is he newly repentant and promised to change because he's been put on the spot by Jesus in front of the big crowd? Or has he been revealed as innocent to the big crowd that's discriminating against him, saying, oh, what a cheat? Maybe it's both and. And so I think that's the beauty of this message, that all of us are invited to change our financial and our professional lives, to become more generous. Because I would say most of us living in the U.S. are more like Zacchaeus than like the poor masses on this planet. And all of us, I think, are invited to change the way we view others. It's easy for us to demonize the rich right now and blame it all on them like they're not us. Or it's easy for wealthy people to have stereotypes about people who are poor. And I think Jesus in these stories is always challenging us to let go of our judgment because it obscures us. It blinds us from seeing the possibility that these role models, these heroes, arise in the most unexpected of people and places. Just like the good Samaritan, the good enemy, the tenacious widow, the little child. Be open to being changed. So speaking of change and being open, it's Reformation Sunday. So, confession to make, when I was raised Catholic, we thought of Martin Luther as evil. What are they protesting about? And, Martin Luther was a monk's monk, deeply devoted. And according to the story, he nailed up 95 theses on the Wittenberg church. It's questionable whether he did that or he just mailed it like a church meeting. We're having a meeting. But these theses, what he was really upset about, what launched the Protestant Reformation, was very simple. the Catholic Church was selling indulgences, which meant you could buy forgiveness. Whatever your sin was, here's the price. Here, this is the cost, and boom, you and your relatives are saved. You're forgiven. And Martin Luther was horrified by this. He said, that is not how grace works. And so often, I think we get so confused about how grace works, teaching people the opposite. Grace is a gift from God, freely given. It's the gift that Jesus gave of his presence that day with Zacchaeus, who could have been demonized by that crowd. I'm coming to your house today. A gift, my presence. And too often, I think churches and religious leaders and institutions become like the dispensers of grace, rather than the ones who just step back and show, here it is, it's here. But that's the history of the church. That's the history of religious institutions that love to make rules, love to say, this is why you should give us money. Churches are flawed. Churches, religious institutions, all of them perpetuate a lot of nonsense because they're so utterly human, with utterly human leaders. There's a history, including trying to suck the joy out of holidays like tomorrow's Halloween, leading people away from God rather than to community. There's a reason why Halloween's so popular, because it's one little glimpse of community, one day of the year where everybody opens up their houses, breaking down all kinds of social barriers. It's a chance to actually get to know the children in your neighborhood and the neighbors. It's a glimpse, I think, of beloved community. Why would we resist that? Jesus comes, as Luke says, to seek out the lost, rich and poor alike, to transform our hearts and our lives, and ultimately to make the flock whole again. And you may think this is as impossible as looking at that valley of dry bones and saying, breathe new life into them. It may seem impossible in this fragmented, polarized country and world that is so full of inequity and corruption and contempt. But remember what Jesus says. What is impossible for us is possible with God today. And so let us give thanks to God. Amen. Speaking of thanks, you can open up your black New Century hymnals and turn to number 419. Now thank we all our God.